Hello and welcome to another episode of Literary Liberation Podcast. Today we'll be discussing, analyzing, and reviewing Notes on an Execution by Danya Kukafka. Mariah and I have adopted a Palestinian family that is currently still stuck in Gaza. Mohammed's neighborhood was bombed and killed 22 members of his family, leaving him responsible for his 4 younger siblings who were pulled from the rubble. We have their family's GoFundMe linked in the description below, and they are very close to their goal. Please donate below. Don't forget that there's a link below to sign up for our free newsletter where you can get more information and updates about us and the podcast. For more content outside of the podcast, please check out our Instagram and TikTok at Literary Liberation and Twitter at LitLibPodcast. I'm your co-host, Kristen. You can find me at KRXXTXN on all social media platforms.
And I'm Mariah, and you can find me at Hungry Rye on all social media platforms.
Full disclaimer, this is a re-recording. We recorded this, I guess, last week at this point, and the audio got messed up, so we're having to re-record this so that for your listening pleasure, you can hear the full conversation and not just parts of it. Other than that, I feel like we won't be too yappy. We're gonna get right into the meat, I think.
Yeah, so Notes on Execution is a pretty popular book. Kristen is the one that originally showed this to me because she found it from a Lexi video, which is Newly Nova. Did a
hmm
review on it, said it was like life changing. So we decided to read it. It has over 100,000 reviews on Goodreads, which is really good.
It was nominated for the Goodreads Choice Award in Best Fiction in 2022 too, which is whenever it came out. So it's a 2-year-old novel at this point, which I feel like is pretty modern, I guess. I feel like this is like random, but like I feel like we normally don't read too many like recent books for the podcast too.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of like quote unquote book talk books are books that have come out a while ago and then some trope marketing or whatever gets it on the For You page and then people pick it up like 5 later or something. Cause I've noticed a lot, I think it's like 2019 is usually like 2018, 2019 or like Tumblr book era is like
Mhm.
books that get popular again, aside from some of the newer like dark romances, which we do tend to review. So this is a relatively new book, and I was very surprised because sometimes newer books, especially like new books from an author, like a debut novel-ish, because this isn't her first novel. I don't
No.
think
It's your
it's
second.
her second. But still, for a second novel, this is very strong.
It makes me I'm very excited to read her first novel. I feel like reading this kind of makes me interested in her writing style, and I know her first novel that was released was also like a national bestseller, and I believe it also is a thriller, so it kind of makes me feel like maybe we could read that and then also have discussions about that too in the future if it's anything like Notes on an Execution is. So Danya Kukafka, she grew up in Colorado, moved to New York City for school. I mean, there's not really too much on her online. She has an Instagram and Twitter, but it's not like they're like there's nothing to delve into. Like she's not like posting like anything like it's more like lifestyle updates rather than it is.
Yeah. So if anyone so at this point in filming, September what 2nd,
Mhm.
2024, we are unaware of any controversies. So this is subject to change. So we're not saying indefinitely. So
Yes.
just
I feel like
putting
we
that
have
out.
to
Anything can happen within now and like the election. Who knows
yeah.
what could come out, but right now everything's looking pretty okay.
The only thing I did do, like, I tried to research her politics, and I just went to her Twitter and, like, typed in, like, Biden and, like, Trump and stuff like that. The only thing that I saw was from 2020 was the last time she tweeted anything, like, relevant to, like, politics in America, is that she was just campaigning for Biden Harris and, like, calling people on the phone or whatever. So it's not like she's doing anything. And that was still before this book came out, so even with her doing maybe more research, she still could have changed her opinions where they're not necessarily in the same vein as what they were. But getting into the summary of the actual book, this book is, I feel like, a very unique book. It's a work of literary suspense that has you following a serial killer on death row 12 hours before he's executed, and you get told his life through the women that were relevant into his life. So you have his mother, you have the detective that caught him, and then you also have uh, his wife's twin sister. are like the three main perspectives that you get in inclusion to also the serial killer's perspective. I don't know. I feel like I you could go more into like the woes and stuff of the women, like, without going into, like, a big deep dive summary. I just feel like this book is kind of best to go in without any of this information as possible. I don't know if you agree with that sentiment,
I
but
mean,
I
that's what I did. I didn't know anything. I knew like jack shit aside from the title of the book. So I was like, okay, well, it's about an execution. I didn't know who was telling whose perspective it was going to be or anything. Kristen's just like, well, we're going to read this. And I said, okay. So then we started reading it. And I really like how it's structured for anyone who is concerned that it's going to be like, I don't know, written in a way where it doesn't prioritize like the victims. It doesn't. It's like you get the inside mind, right? The true crime-esque of why a serial killer would do it, but also it's like really focused on like how detrimental this person's actions have been on the people in his life, especially like women. So you're getting more of that perspective. So it's not.
it's not like a creepy, like, dark romance where you're getting, like, the good gu like, the vigilante serial killer man sort of vibe. It's definitely, like, a serious piece of fiction that you're supposed to like extract the meaning out of because you get this unreliable narrator that's like pushing ahead their own perspectives and his own thoughts that and you can see how those are negative on society by how they affect the women that were in his life. I mean, overall, this book has really high ratings. It has 4.07 stars out of 102 ratings, which is pretty. I feel like comparatively, I feel like any books that we see with that many reviews, usually they don't have that high of reviews. It's a lot more middle of the road. Rather this, I feel like it's almost entirely positive, where there are some a few criticisms that I can see throughout this book that I think don't necessarily make the book detrimental to read. It makes it more important to read. Where I feel like the problem is you can't really discuss these criticisms without going into the spoilers of the book too. So I think we probably won't go too much into that just yet. But I just want to say that like this book is like my babble of this year. I wholeheartedly recommend it. I think everyone should read it. I think it's a book that literally like anybody in the world should read it or experience this story in some type of way. Because I think it's a great way to discuss your own like morals and what you believe and how you think about the justice system within the United States and the justice system in general, as like how it would be under like a communist society, what have you.
I would agree. I think we both ended up rating it really hard. I think, sorry, ended up rating it really high in regards to a lot of the other books that we've read this year. We both rated it 5 star. Kristen may have rated it even higher. This might be a 6 star read.
I think I
Um,
could see it being a six-star read for me, yeah, definitely.
because the
I
longer that we've mulled on it, because originally we had recorded this like right afterwards, it's just a really incredible book. I've talked to like family members about it too, and they want to read it. So I'm gonna have to go pick up at least one physical copy of this. This is like if I were to have a tier list of books that if I read it on an e-reader, would I go out and physically like purchase the book? It's one of those books. Like it's good enough
I
to put
did
it on your trophy shelf.
yeah, I did physically buy one, but my copy is not in yet. I went to a local bookstore and it's taken a little longer. I think it's finally gonna be in this week though, so I can actually go get it, and I'm very excited to have a physical copy of that book because I think it's just so life-changing. I think it's life-changing in the way that you can have so many complex thoughts that you wouldn't typically or normally have just in your regular day-to-day life, but I feel like it's still so relevant, especially within the political climate of America and how much, like, politicians and everyone focuses on crime, I think.
Yeah, and Chris and I have also discussed how we think this is a book that we both think is best read with somebody else. I
Oh,
think it's a really
100%.
great book read, like book club read that you can pick, work on it over the course of a month and have discussions periodically through it because there's just so many layers, nuances, and things that you can talk about in context to like our current legal system and whatnot. And if you are somebody that is more principled and like prison and police abolition, I think this would be a really good way to kind of spearhead conversations with maybe the people in your life that aren't as comfortable with those topics, but this would be a really good way to segue them into reading more on like the new Jim Crow and like white supremacy and capitalism and patriarchy and like all of that jazz. So this is a really good intro book, I think, for
To get
some people.
people thinking about those perspectives that they maybe have not been thinking about or they've been staunchly against, I think, because Um, I don't wanna say too many spoilers, so we can definitely go into this, but I do think it's a very realistic look at people that are in the criminal system within the United States and the people that are currently in prison within the United States that are directly on death row or even just life in prison anyways. But I'd say me and Mariah are, like, going to fully recommend. Do not you need to read this book. I think anybody that has any type of interest in our podcast should read this book. Anybody that's, like, have any type of interest in, like, true crime, thriller, like, even though it's not ethical to consume most true crime things because of how they do, portray the victims and stuff like that, I feel like this is a great way to read about true crime that's fictional, but then still get, like, the real world thoughts that are surrounding it.
At least now we can get into some of the criticisms because last week before, Kristen had gone finished this book way faster than I had anticipated in like 3 days flat or something nuts. And that was being respectful of the time.
I
Like she
slowed
wanted the
down.
time to like slowed it down for herself so she could finish the book in a day, but also like have the last little like 25% so that she could mull it over. Went to the Goodreads reviews, saw some of the one-star ratings, and had a
Mhm.
lot of thoughts and opinions in regards to that, but we could only discuss these in the context of, like, the spoiler zone because there's a lot to unpack.
Not that necessarily I think this book can really be spoiled either, because it's kind of one of those books where you know obviously what happens in the first page of the book. You see that the main character's set to be executed in 12 hours. I mean, I think it takes a really realistic approach to probably how a lot of people are viewing um their last couple hours. I know what maybe if you wanted to talk about like transformative justice and restorative justice real quick before too we go into like our fully nuanced opinions.
So this is just the disclaimer as we're getting into it. Kristen and I are very much a fan of police and prison abolition. We find that very important, especially being Marxist, because we understand like the intricacies of how like the prison industrial complex like functions not only like internally but internationally. And so we think it's really important to embrace this type of framework as we are going through it and telling you all a little bit about it. So if you don't know, you'll have a little bit of areas to research upon yourself. Our current system is considered like a retributive justice. And it's like a quote unquote, I believe I got this off of Wikipedia, is a legal concept whereby the criminal offender receives punishment proportional or similar to the crime. So it originally like this whole system was invented as opposed to like revenge, which
It's like eye for an eye sort of
yeah, so
like
we don't have, like, that eye for an eye, it's not I mean, it was at one point, like, rooted
yeah.
in, like you can kind of see, like, with, like, death penalty, like, if you kill somebody, you should just, like, get death penalty, however, death penalty historically has been used against marginalized groups, specifically in the United States against Black men after, like, the Jim Crow era, or after, the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and we had the emergence of the prison industrial complex and whatnot. So this was just, like, a
Mhm.
means of, like,
Continuing that
eugenics.
oppression.
Yeah. So there is two different areas of thought that people technically get like thrown in, and I do see the terms used interchangeably. So there are some people who I would say are like the rad libs that use like a restorative justice framework, which exists within like the retributive justice framework that we have. So there's still like prisons, but it's more so aimed at repairing the harm done to victims. So this is more of like the Nordic model, I would say, of crime and punishment. So there's still probably like long times that you probably serve a life sentence, but it's more so centered around like trying to fix some of that mentality. However, it doesn't seek to eradicate the root issues that lead people to commit crime, but just kind of like superficial things. It's better than what we have going on right now, but it's
Mhm.
still not good. Whereas we support transformative justice, which is a So, transformative justice is a political framework and approach for responding to violence, harm, and abuse. At its most basic, it seeks to respond to violence without creating more violence and or engaging in harm reduction to lessen the violence. Transformative justice is a framework that understands systems such as prisons, police, and ICE as sites where enormous amounts of violence take place, and as systems that were created to be inherently violent in order to maintain social control. You can learn more about this on like the Transformative Justice website. I believe it's transformharm.org if you want some like intro ideas. And there's several books that you can read as well, which I will try to like include in the description of this. But that's the framework that we are approaching this from,
Yes.
because it's anti-imperialist. It is against like white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, whatnot. Like this is a liberatory framework. Yeah, I think I'm gonna leave it at that. I think that's like best part. I think those were like the things I said before. I can't remember.
That's just mostly I just wanted to go into that before we, like, severely, like, talked about this because I feel like it can get misconstrued in different ways if we just say these thoughts without, like, firmly defining our opinions and what we believe. So I think officially we can go into the spoiler zone. I just wanted to say this book, I've already been praising it a lot, and I do really love it. I love the unique perspective that you get because a lot of the times in books and stuff like that, and most things that like surrounding people that get put into prisons or people that get arrested and stuff like that, they get already such a negative like media presence put onto them no matter what the crime is without even having fully all the evidence and things like that where I think this book does a really good job at showing that, like, the people that commit crimes are still people too. And I think that's a big understanding that I feel like a lot of people in the world, but specifically Americans, don't like to grapple with the fact that not that human nature is like an inherently evil thing, but that, like, because of capitalism and things like that, are the reason why people are more inherently violent and have to be violent within our society and stuff like that, where I think it's really important to show those perspectives because that's why these things happen. And rather like snipping these issues at the root cause, people and like wealthy business people in America are just finding ways to extrapolate profit out of harmful things. Because you can look at like the people that get arrested for killing people and stuff like that. They don't actually learn what they did was wrong. What they learn is how they just learn to start doing free labor for these large companies like Target, Walmart. They all profit off of prison labor specifically. And I think that's one thing that like this book doesn't go into, but I feel like it also kind of reminds you of those things if you're aware of those parts within the prison industrial complex.
Also, I know there was a lot of not I don't think it was a lot, but there was too many, even if it's one comment of people saying that this book was trying to romanticize the main male character Ansel's him as a person, and that was like a bad thing. That's not what like this book is doing. It's just showcasing that people who are in prisons are human beings. Like that was
Yeah,
what it's trying to do, is try to highlight that, but also show that he's still like objectively a bad thing who, or he's objectively a bad person who did bad things, and that had he had been given like the adequate resources or lived under a different system that prioritized peoples over profits, or oppression of subjugation of women, you know, like all of those things, he would have been able to flourish because his whole life was founded on like violence.
and trauma and everything like that. And I think this book does a good job in showing that because we see Ansel from a young age. This book also does take place. It takes place. I think Ansel's born in the 70s or something like that. So I do think that's a very interesting time work to place it in too, because obviously, like things are very different now than what they were in the 70s, and I feel like the 70s, like like in like the mid 1900s or so, that's kind of when like I feel like serial killing and like killings in general were kind of more on a rise, at least more in the public eyes rather than they are now, and even that they were like before that. So I think it's really interesting that people are complaining about that Ansel garners too much sympathy or whatever for himself, whenever he is the product of his conditions, of him being abandoned by his mother at a young age, where I don't blame the mother because she had to do it out of selfishness, but then also, like, out of protecting herself in the selfishness, but also out of necessity where she could have just ended up losing her life in the same way as how other people do because of the life that he was put into. And the fact is, like, at a young age, you can see him killing animals and things like that, like, doing psychologically things that are different than what a neurotypical child would be doing. And if we actually had the resources for, like, children that are in foster homes and things like that, he would not have been though this book wouldn't exist under communism, basically, because the idea is that, like, these children would be in a community where they actually get help for their mental illness and things like that, which is, I would argue, obviously a large reason why Ansel committed these murders is because he obviously had unresolved trauma within his life where if he were able to get, like, the therapy or the medication or whatever it is that he needed as a person, it would not have happened.
Yeah. I strongly believe that, and we are not trying to come from a position that every single person who is in prison for like violent acts against women is somehow like
Yes.
mentally ill. We don't believe that, but this specific instance, like you can see his like mentality and how he's trying to rationalize and kind of like philosophize about why he turned out the way he did, like why people left him and whatnot. Like you could tell he's just a very deeply troubled man who was trying to do it himself, but just kept going down the wrong path and it ultimately ends up becoming like unredeemable as a human being. Like he just goes too
Yes.
far.
And it's I mean, the thing is too is that even though, like, Ansel isn't a deeply violent person that committed these atrocities, he is still getting treated the same as somebody who did a nonviolent drug crime as well. Like, even though he's not obviously a person who does a nonviolent drug crime, they're not sent to death row, but they're still in the exact same prisons as other people, and they're still set to go co-inhabit it and then co-live within these prisons that are unclean, unsanitary, unsafe, whatever you have, that these so many people that even don't even deserve to be on that same type of level of, like, evil being as Ansel is, are still getting treated the exact same because of racism in America.
Yeah, because if people don't know that, according to like the Death Penalty Information Center, that since 1973, at least 200 people have been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in the United States, who have been exonerated. So like they were actually innocent, which is kind of scary, and then also up to 200, over 100 were Black. So,
Yeah,
to put that into
it's
perspective, like, Black men are making a disproportionate amount of this, whereas we see, like, white collar crime and, like, white men in general, like Jeffrey Epstein and whatnot, like, those types of people will not face any sort of, like, punishment. So, just death penalty sentencing, like, historically and to this day, like, does not act as a detriment to, like, violent crimes. It's just meant as, like, state sanctioned violence and murder against people.
exactly. And I think this is one of those things where, like, this book brings up, like, big discussions about does the state even have the right to decide who lives and who dies in those ways? Because that's kind of what happens. And not even to mention the death penalty is more expensive on people's tax dollars than non-death penalty. It's so much more expensive. And the fact that, like, people don't care. Like, the fact that, like, anybody that's pro death penalty have no idea what's going on within it.
And a lot of people will say, like, oh, well, like, what about the rapist? And I think this brings up a really good point because I'm sure that when we get this posted or we post clips of it, people are going to ask that, like, oh, death penalty and like rapist. One, they
Yeah.
don't face the death penalty because one, they never like get in trouble anyways.
They already don't get reported, for one, like, it's, like,
It's
barely any
extremely
percentage.
underreported. But even if you have all of the you almost have to have it, like, on, like, camera, and even then, there's still, like, the likelihood that
It's
they're gonna be charged with anything is
or
so
even serve jail
minuscule.
time.
Yeah, it's actually insane. So anyone that wants to learn more about this, there is, like, a anarchist zine that is called What About the Rapist? I highly recommend it. It's my best reference for people who are curious about this. I think it's a really great segue off of this because this is about a man who commits violence against women, and although he is not, like, sexually assaulting women. His father is somebody who did sexually assault his mother. So
Yes.
keep that in mind, maybe check that out and kind of get an understanding of the framework that we're coming from.
The next kind of main complaint was that people complaining about propaganda within this story, and I think that was, like it kinda goes on with my point earlier about how this book couldn't exist under communism. It's like, unfortunately, like, murders don't get solved unless the cops solve them. Like, that's kind of how society is ran right now. That's kind of what they're expected to do, even though they don't do it right or well. But I do think this book still does a great job at discussing with the main character being a police officer, critiquing her and her beliefs of her idea of being able to change, like, the police station from the inside or whatever it is directly that she believes. But then also, it talks about multiple times where whenever the murders are committed, they find the bodies or whatever, and they try to pin it on a random homeless man that has nothing to do with the crime or the people. He just has, like, he ended up getting off on a drug charge or something, and so the captain of the precinct is like offended by that and still wants him in jail. And so he's planning on pinning these murders on this guy, which it obviously doesn't work because it's not actually him that did that crime.
So, and like, I feel like you end up seeing this like throughout it, just like how the justice system works and how their priorities are wrong. So it's not like inherent propaganda where it's suggesting that the police are going to be the ones to solve it. But it's just if this police officer who did know this human being growing up knew his actions and his character, like if she had not been that person, he would have never gotten caught.
And I think that's one thing too is it's like the way the story is written and the way that this story ends up being like solved in the way that Safi ends up solving like the murders itself is that none of that could have happened if she didn't end up like if her mother didn't end up dying, then she would have never been able to solve these murders and like prevented like a serial killer being out and about roaming free. I think this book does a really great job at like even though it's like propaganda in a way that because you get like the police procedurals from Sappy's perspective, but it's also like I don't know how you would be able to do a book where you're solving a murder without having those perspectives because we live in capitalist society. Like of course like the things that happen within capitalistic society can only be solved through that lens, basically.
Pretty much. I mean, like the whole like policing and like investigation system, they're the ones that are gonna have all of the like DNA, all of the evidence. That's where it's gonna go under our society. So just I think it would be propaganda or like propaganda specifically if it was saying like, "Look how good of a job they did." It is required in our society to keep them going. Like we need them. We have an objective need for them. Whereas this is critiquing just the way that it's functioning and exposing some of the kind of um the myths that we have been socialized into believing about the policing system as a whole. We could talk about some of the themes.
Because you're really obsessed with that blue house.
I thought that was interesting because we have like this really interesting, like this is like an Ansel theme, which makes him kind of seem kind of above, where you're almost questioning whether or not like this person who's just so highly intelligent was capable of doing this violent act. And because it only happened over the course of one summer, like what is the possibility? But he did end up doing it. But the blue house throughout this book is a theme where you have Lavender, who is Ansel's mother, who has this locket of a blue house, like where she grew up, and she takes it with her. She ends up putting it on Ansel and saying that if he has this, it'll keep him safe. And then ends up taking it off him accidentally one night. And when she ends up like leaving to like free herself and the children, he's left without it. So he's has this in the back of his mind that he needs this object to keep him
This piece
safe.
of
So that is
jewelry.
why he is killing these girls and stealing like their blue house, like their locket that has their thing in it to keep him safe. And he's like actively trying to like understand this. And then he learns that his brother is actually alive, who was a baby, and ends up naming his daughter Blue. Her name's like Beatrice, and then they also have
Mhm.
like the Blue House. So I thought this was a really interesting segue because like the other brother, the baby who ends up getting adopted, which typically ends up happening with
To babies.
to babies all the time. Babies are wanted, unfortunately, whereas children who have memories and trauma are not. where he got to grow up in a protected household at like a petty bourgeois. Like, there was a nice like middle income family who was able to support him throughout his life, and he didn't turn into a violent
Violent.
serial killer for a summer in the same way that his brother who did remember the trauma did. So I thought it was interesting, like this idea of like blue house being safety was just an interesting theme throughout the whole book. Because like Ansel, like he really like
Yeah.
leashes on to his niece.
And then that's kind of like where he goes into the blue house and stuff like that, and then that's also where it causes him to commit his final murder, where he kind of ends up flying off the handle because whenever Safi sees him regularly going to this house, and she knows obviously that he is not a safe person to be around, where it's not necessarily that he's a dangerous person, because you can see where he hasn't committed any other acts of violence since that summer where he did that. So obviously he has some type of like mental capacity to not just be violent towards whatever. And then like everyone was saying that like, oh, like he was getting better, like he seemed like a good guy, where whether or not that was like him just being psychopathic and able to manipulate the view that he had around him or what have you. But then Safi going in and destroying that blue house for him by her going in and letting his niece and her mother know that, like, hey, he's a very dangerous man. We can't get him locked up. We can't pin these murders on him, but I'm pretty sure these murders are him. I knew him growing up. It fits directly what I know and what I've been researching. And so then ultimately that causes them to kick out Ansel. Ansel leaves and he realizes that like life fucking sucks, so he goes to kill Jenny, his wife, and he ends
Which
up
it
going.
wasn't even his originally, like, intention, like, he just wanted to, like,
No.
go and get comforted because she became, like, his blue house, his, like, thing that kept him safe because she understood and listened to him,
Yeah.
and then sees that some other,
She's
like,
moved
doctor,
on.
nurse is, like, showing her attention, and something just snaps in his head, and he's like, "Nothing is safe anymore."
Yeah, and so then he ends up killing Jenny, which I think that scene is really important too, because right afterwards, whenever you go back to Sappy's perspective and she sits there and she realizes that she didn't actually save anybody because she still resulted in the death of Jenny. Where But then it's almost like Jenny's death was also necessary, because if that didn't happen, then they definitely wouldn't have been able to pin those other murders onto Ansel, because they wouldn't have gotten him into questioning and then gotten his confession in those ways. And so I think that kind of goes into the other like concept or like theme of this book about like the multiverse and about like what decisions you make and how they impact your future and your life forever.
Yeah, whereas he's kind of fixated on it being almost like diluted by the idea of there being separate ideas, whereas Saffron is more in tune with the fact that this is just the one reality that you have and you can't kind of dwell on that. You have to make the best with what material like you're living with. And by like
Mhm.
doing all of these things, you can think about it and write your manifesto that he's so determined is not a manifesto. It's actually like a legitimate philosophy. It's not going to change, it's not gonna change, like, you already went through all those things, and you have to, like, do the
You
work.
have to live your life as experiencing all those things. You can't change or imagine other lives where you could have done it better or could have done it right. And I do think that's an important message that I think a lot of people could think about too, because I mean, that's something that I feel like all the time people are thinking about and discussing was like, well, if I just did this one thing right, then my whole life I'd be a millionaire or I'd be rich or I'd be happy, sort of thing. Whenever that's kind of not how the world works, unfortunately.
Makes you wonder what would have happened if Ansel would have picked up, like, Marx instead
Yeah.
of, like,
Well, because
Sartre, like, and really, like, and analyze, like,
material
his
condition.
material conditions and, like, how everything kind of went the way it did, but instead, he kind of went down the, like, incel pathway
Yes.
and refused, and he's like, "Well, no, people aren't just inherently good or evil," which, yes, we don't think people are just inherently, like, bad. They're not
Yeah.
inherently greedy or violent. You're a product of your conditions. However, he didn't take it any further. He kind of got stuck with one that really resonated with him and kind of kept that myopic philosophical view moving forward because he had a confirmation bias. He's just like, yep, this one works for me. I don't need anything
That's
else.
all I
Feminist
need.
theory?
Yeah.
Nope. I'm done.
Well, because you said I remember you pointed out, like, in this where there was a scene where Ansel's talking about his major and like he's a philosophy major, obviously, and so he's reading a lot of philosophers and stuff like that. And you said that was interesting the specific philosopher he brought up too.
Yeah, he said that he was reading like John Paul Sartre, and if you don't know, he was like in intimate relationships. I don't think they ever got properly married, but I think they could have at one point. I don't remember, but she is the one that wrote The Second Sex, which is
His
an
wife,
incredibly, yes,
or
his
his
wife
partner.
or partner, life partner, wrote The Second Sex, which was and still is an incredibly influential piece of feminist literature. I believe John Paul Sartre was also a feminist at the time as well, and it's just interesting that he wouldn't look into her work, even though, like, they lived together, they theorized together, but he just kept to Sartre's work.
I mean, I think it's
So
even
it's an
interesting.
interesting.
I think it shows kind of how smart the author is for like specifically cherry picking like that philosopher and putting it in that scene in that way, because I mean, like, I didn't even notice that because like I don't know that many philosophers like that. So like the fact that you were able to extract that and notice that is, I think, shows like how much even research the author did on like violence against women and like these type of people that are deciding to do these extremely violent acts and like what they think. Because it also goes in like the whole reason Ansel decided to drop out of college is because he was like overlooked for an internship that went to a woman instead. And so he's just like an inherently sexist person because of his conditions.
Because in his mind, he's being like constantly disenfranchised and put down and beaten down by women his whole life, which is why he doesn't like them. Like his mother, he can't figure out why she abandoned him. He can't figure out why like no other women like stuck around or laughed at him. That's like his one thing. Is like the humiliation is like it sticks with him and does something in his head where he like turns violent and he remembers every time somebody laughs at him because there is a young woman, they're like children, like 12 years old, who laughed at him when they were younger and then ends up being like his last victim, that killing spree when he was 17.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting perspective in that way because since he obviously doesn't have like he doesn't have all of his memories from whenever his mom left him. He barely even remembers his mother. He says he can only like remember like the curl of her hair or whatever. Like he can't even fully remember her. So it obviously shows that like he doesn't even know the reason why he was abandoned was because of how inherently violent his father was towards his mother.
And I think he conflates the idea of her being like selfish with her looking out for her best self interest because they all objectively would have been killed had she not decided that they needed to leave that day. Could she have gone and gotten the children? Probably, but she didn't have the
But
material
she
resources to
didn't
take
know
care
how to
of them.
drive. She didn't have a
She couldn't
driver's
drive.
license.
She has no
She was
work skills, like, she's been sheltered in the middle of the woods,
She has no
doing
friends, no
nothing.
family outside of like she's literally was not allowed to leave the property to go and meet and make connections with other people where like even now like a lot of the times a lot of women even get critiqued whenever they get killed by their violent husbands, or it's like, well, if he was abusive, why didn't she just leave, sort of thing. And it's like women do work hard to try to leave these things, but then it's also not always so easy to do if you don't have, if you're not the breadwinner in your family, if you're not able, if you're incredibly sheltered and stuck in your area, then of course you're not going to be able to get out of that situation. But if you have like the material conditions and the material means to move where you're able to support yourself and your family, then that's obviously you should do that. And there's communities and support for those things too.
Which I also thought was really interesting is after she ended up leaving and she's like going across the country to California, she ends up becoming like a sex worker. And
Hmm.
I've noticed a lot of people that get into that line of work were like stay-at-home moms. They're people that didn't have any sort of resources or like skills. They need the flexible hours, the immediate income because of our capitalist society and also because of the patriarchy, because like men are the ones who are going to predominantly be paying for these services. So she had to
Hmm.
use literally like the tools that she had at hand so that she could support herself. And I find that a really interesting critique because people will always try to villainize sex workers without acknowledging the material conditions that are leading women into this line of work.
I don't know if there's too much else we can really say though. Like,
I think the last little bit that we're going to end on is the actual execution because I think this is probably one of the more most
oh,
important scenes of this is you're realizing as he is like waiting in the room, he's getting hooked up to his IVs because that's how like he's getting a lethal injection. Is you get to go through kind of the motions and emotions of the people in the room, and many of them are starting to realize that like
His
him
death doesn't
dying,
accomplish anything.
it's not going to bring anyone back. It's not really fixing anything, and that's that. You see Jenny's mother, who has known him more than his own mother, is having like these conflicting feelings. You see Hazel. Hazel still is like going through, like, she's realizing that she
It's
wanted it
not
so bad.
fair
And then
that
it's here.
he
Mhm.
it's not fair
It's like,
that
wow,
he's
he did
getting the
all that.
attention and he gets, like, the perspective onto him whenever Jenny is still murdered and dead, and she gets no type of justice or nothing that actually for her, even though it's supposed to be some type of, like, closure for the family, but this doesn't bring any closure to anybody in any way. I mean, I'm sure for some people, I can imagine some people, if they have that sort of like revenge feeling, it brings them justice. But I feel like a lot of the times for the victim's family, you want to do what's best for the victim's family. And who decides that these people get the death penalty is not even the victim's family. It's random people on a jury that decide that, or even a judge that does not know what these families even want. And I feel like there's a really good quote in the book, like whenever he's dying, wherever it says, "Justice does not feel like compensation. It does not even feel like satisfaction." Because that's the justice that we get in our justice system within the United States.
I thought I had thoughts.
None.
No, that summarized it. That was like one of the best lines in the whole book. Is this was just a really great read. It was very emotional because as a reader, you're kind of conflicted. At least I felt very conflicted at
Yeah.
points because you're just it's not that like you feel bad for Ansel, like, "Oh my god, like, he's the victim," but he
Rest
is,
in
like, a victim in
peace.
his own way. Because you see, like, a small child especially I feel like if you're a parent or you help raise small children, take care of them in any form, like, to see, like, a small child who, like, had such potential and was so intelligent be robbed of that potential and then be transformed by a society that doesn't give a shit about them to become this and then harm other people, like perpetuating that harm. It's just
Mhm.
really frustrating and sad to see, even
Well,
though it's not real, but you know it's real because it does happen in real life.
that's the thing too with, like, a lot of the times even giving, like, people, like, the electric chair or lethal injection, this is what they want. They want that media attention. That's, like, even what Ansel was talking about, like, because there's a whole plot of him planning on escaping, but he's like, "Oh, it doesn't matter, like, if I escape, at least, like, my theory will be out there for people to read and be published and be consumed by everybody." But it's like, no, it won't because you don't deserve that. You don't deserve your ideas and your feelings to be spread around for society to experience. And I think that's one thing where it's like if you even whenever they do the the lethal injections, like these people get to say their last words where like they can even decide to say something that is incredibly stupid to us, but then it could be like something that causes someone to do an incredibly violent act if they're like idolizing this person.
Yeah. So,
Mhm.
I don't know where else to go with that. That was like pretty solid. Um,
All right. Well, then I guess thank you for listening to this episode of Literary Liberation. Don't forget to donate to Muhammad's family below. And next week's episode will be Bunny by Mona Awad.
Awad. Yes, we're getting
Um,
into spookier reads.
yes.
We might end up doing a little like mini series talking about some like children's books. I'm not quite sure yet, but it's up in the air. They might go up, they might not. Don't hold me accountable to that. But thank you for listening. We appreciate your viewership. And if you haven't caught up on any of our other episodes, we just did a tier list ranking up every single book and or series that we had on the account. So if you find any of those interesting and want our thoughts on them, we have episodes for them.
All right. Thank you and good night.